Hi, I'm Joe, a sensitivity educator. Today I'd like to talk to highly sensitive people who find it difficult to communicate their thoughts to others. When HSPs try to talk about things, their thoughts often get tangled up and many lose track of what they want to say. So today I'm going to share 4 practical tips on what you can do about this. So let's get into it now. Number 1 is let go of perfect speaking. Whether it's a casual chat or a job interview, HSPs often fear upsetting the other person, so they overcompensate by trying to please them or sound flawless, which ironically paralyzes their communication. This is because the rush to speak perfectly triggers panic, causing your thought to go off track and lose structure. Neuroscientifically, HSPs process information deeply. This forces us to multitask in real time, analyzing what we say, how we say it, how the other's facial expression looks, and how they are reacting, all at the same time. And as a result, the brain gets overloaded, leading to mental clutter. Usually when we speak, there's just one core message. For example, when you order at a cafe, you usually narrow your choice down to one item. So if you say, "A hot coffee please," that's all it takes to communicate. But when you panic and try to speak perfectly, you end up blurting out all your internal overthinking, like, "Oh, maybe I want iced coffee instead. Wait, that cake looks good too. Oh, and there's a big lineup behind me, so I have to hurry." And as you can imagine, the cafe staff in this case wouldn't know what to make. And this is what goes on in our usual conversations. This also happens in job interviews when you try to over-deliver. So you try to share everything at once, your strengths, your values, and your passion, all in a single breath. But in reality, our idea of a person is not formed just by words. For instance, it can be first impressions, the way like I'm choosing my words now, our tone of voice, or even hand gestures. So these are all parts of communication. That's why a flawless, polished way of speaking isn't everything. Of course, people do listen to the content itself, but at the same time, they're also reading your sincerity, your tone, and the vibe you project. And especially during everyday small talk, or when you're with somebody you're not that close to, they aren't really paying attention to the fine details of your words or technique. What's more important is whether your main message is delivered clearly, which is what allows for better communication. So in conclusion, it does take a bit of practice, but I hope you can slowly let go of trying to speak perfectly and instead shift your focus to what you want to deliver as the core message. Next, number 2 is communicate using nonverbal cues. I mentioned hand gestures earlier, but by incorporating nonverbal cues like this, HSPs can actually communicate more effectively. For example, your facial expression and emotions can convey so much without you saying a word. If you speak with a smile, the other person can sense that you're enjoying the conversation. This makes them feel more cheerful too, allowing the possibility of interaction to flow more naturally. On the other hand, if you're tense, the other person will naturally feel tense as well. Next time you're talking, try looking into the other person's eyes. You might notice that even though their face is smiling, their eyes aren't truly smiling. That's a sign of tension. In other words, they're trying to read your reaction. They're playing it safe to avoid any awkwardness. Neuroscience shows that the human brain has a mechanism called mirror neurons, which reflects the state of others like a mirror. This means if you're overthinking your words and you look nervous, the other person's brain automatically enters the same tense mode just by looking at you. So by constantly trying to accommodate and overthinking every word, HSPs are actually making the other person feel tense as well. HSPs tend to not want to upset the other person, but if you truly want to avoid bothering them, it means it's okay to speak more casually. But again, if you keep over analyzing your words just to try and sound casual, you'll end up spinning your wheels. That's why if you utilize nonverbal cues, like maintaining a smile or using hand gestures, your message will get across more efficiently. For me, when I get stuck on my words, I often just use a simple thumbs up, which frequently softens the mood in the room, and it's quite useful for me. So I suggest aiming to lower the communication cost. creating a space where the other person doesn't feel the need to over-filter their words. When you can do this, the conversation will naturally pick up and your message will get across much easier. So I hope you give this a try. Next, number 3 is focus on improving your first impression. This is something psychology research actually shows. Within the first 0.1 seconds of seeing somebody, our brains unconsciously decide if they're trustworthy or what kind of people they are. Because that first impression carries so much weight, sometimes the words you actually say just fade into the background. Of course, this doesn't mean the other person isn't listening at all, but the human brain has a strong tendency to justify that very first impression. For example, in a job interview, there are cases the interviewer unconsciously interprets your words based on their gut feeling. The filter of your first impression can actually shape how persuasive you sound more than the actual content. That's why the first thing we need to look at is cleanliness, which plays a big role in your first impression. To take an extreme example, imagine 2 people showing up for an interview, one with a neat, clean appearance and another looking like they just rolled out of bed. Even if they both share the exact same brilliance during the interview, the impression they leave will be completely different from the start. When your appearance is clean, the other person's brain listens with a positive assumption, what psychology calls the halo effect. This is where if one part of a person looks good, the other person's brain automatically assumes everything else is good as well. It simply sets your baseline higher right from the start. Conversely, if cleanliness is lacking, the other person will unconsciously listen with their guards up. So no matter how good your content is, it makes it harder to get your word across. And a large part of that first impression comes down to your daily habits. Keeping your hair neat, caring for your skin, or practicing lifting up the corners of your mouth. So this self-care is not a trick to fake your way through. It simply builds a healthy foundation to help your real voice better be heard. So I hope you'll keep this sense of cleanliness in mind as well. Last, number 4 is give your conversation a headline. In other words, start with your conclusion. For example, I just stated, give your conversation a headline, which is starting with the conclusion. Just like the chapters or cuts in my videos, this keeps you from getting lost. Viewers always know exactly where they are and what topic they're listening to. Conversation is exactly the same. Starting with the conclusion is like giving the other person's brain these chapters. It instantly lets them think, we're talking about this topic right now. But on the other hand, when you explain too deeply without that conclusion first, you leave the other person confused, wondering, wait, what are you trying to say? So what happens is HSPs often lose track of their own thoughts mid-speech, and once that connection breaks, you end up wondering what you were even trying to say. This is because of depth of processing, which is a core HSP trait. So your mind gets flooded with so many thoughts that you feel pressured to share everything, causing your message to scatter. For instance, in my professional consulting practice, I see 2 distinct patterns. In the first pattern, people present their core message first, writing, I'm struggling with XYZ. But in the second pattern, they write a long chain of recent events and background context, only to end up with, so what do you think, at the end. So without that clear conclusion, even from a professional standpoint, it becomes difficult to know exactly where to focus to provide the right solution. And as a result, you can only offer superficial advice, which often leads to slightly unfulfilling outcome for both sides. So to avoid that, HSPs should first zero in on the conclusion, what you want to know or what you want to convey. For example, when you report something at work, the conclusion is usually already set. It's usually either, I made this mistake, or how does this look? So it's best to just consult on that single point rather than explaining the entire process. On the other hand, if it's just a casual chat, there's no conclusion needed, so it's completely okay to talk about anything. So before you start speaking, I want you to consider whether the current conversation requires a conclusion or not. Just by keeping this in mind will drastically improve your communication and make your speaking so much clearer. So I hope you give this a try as well. So today we looked at 4 ways to help HSPs share their thoughts smoothly without getting lost in communication. Here at Sensipath, I share these detailed insights and often overlooked perspectives for HSPs, blending psychology, science, and my real-life experience as an HSP. If you found this helpful, I'd be glad if you stay connected. That's all for today. This was Joe from Sensipath.